The final whistle echoes through the stadium, but for the briefest moment, it feels as though the entire world has forgotten how to breathe. More than 80,000 people remain frozen in place, their eyes fixed on the sea of yellow shirts collapsing onto the grass. Then it happens. A deafening roar explodes from every corner of the arena, surging into the night like a force of nature. In Rio de Janeiro, strangers embrace as if they have known each other all their lives. In São Paulo, fireworks erupt before the referee has even lowered his whistle. Across tiny villages hidden deep within the Amazon rainforest, old televisions flicker as families leap to their feet in disbelief. Children scream, grown men cry without shame. Elderly supporters who have waited decades for this moment simply close their eyes, overwhelmed by memories too powerful to describe. Brazil is world champion once again, and within seconds, an entire nation rediscovers a feeling it feared might have disappeared forever. The players barely know where to run. Some sprint toward the corner flag before collapsing under a mountain of teammates, while others simply fall onto their knees, staring into the sky as tears roll freely down their faces. The goalkeeper buries his head in the grass, his gloves trembling uncontrollably after producing the save that will be replayed for generations. The captain stands motionless at midfield, surrounded by chaos, unable to comprehend that the dream he has carried since childhood is no longer a dream at all. Around him, cameras race across the pitch, desperate to capture every expression before it vanishes forever. Only a few minutes earlier, the atmosphere had been almost unbearable. The scoreboard showed Brazil leading by a single goal, but every pass felt dangerous, every clearance seemed too short, and every second stretched into eternity. The opposing team threw everything forward, launching cross after cross into the penalty area, as thousands of Brazilian supporters held their breath with every bouncing ball. The stadium had become a battlefield of nerves rather than football, where confidence no longer mattered and survival was all that remained. Then came the final attack. The ball was whipped into the box one last time, hanging beneath the floodlights like it refused to come back down. Defenders rose into the air alongside desperate attackers, shoulders crashing together with incredible force. For a split second, the ball floated freely above everyone, before a Brazilian defender connected with a towering header that sent it spinning toward midfield. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't beautiful, it was simply enough. The referee looked at his watch. One glance, one whistle. History. Every player wearing yellow instantly understood that the years of pressure, criticism, expectation and heartbreak had disappeared in a single breath. Since childhood, they had lived beneath the enormous shadow created by generations before them. Every promising teenager had been compared to Pelé. Every gifted playmaker had been measured against Zico. Every creative genius had been asked whether he could become the next Ronaldinho. Every goalscorer had inevitably been compared to Ronaldo Nazario. The weight of Brazilian football had never been carried by 11 men alone. It had always been carried by millions. Tonight, that weight finally became wings. Inside the stands, fathers who once watched the heartbreak of 2014 now lifted their own children onto their shoulders. Many of those children had grown up hearing stories rather than creating memories. They knew about Brazil's greatness through old documentaries, faded photographs, and endless highlight reels shared across generations. They had watched clips of Pelé smiling with the Jules Rimet trophy, Ronaldo dominating defenders, Rivaldo's impossible technique, and Kaká's elegance. But they had never experienced that feeling themselves. Now they were living it. Television cameras moved through the crowd, capturing faces that seemed almost impossible to believe. Elderly women covered their mouths while crying uncontrollably. Teenagers who had never seen Brazil crowned world champions hugged complete strangers. Entire families draped in green and yellow flags stood together in silence before suddenly bursting into uncontrollable celebration. It was no longer about football alone. It was about identity, memory, and belonging. Thousands of kilometers away, Brazil itself had already transformed into one enormous stadium. The beaches of Copacabana were packed with supporters who had watched the final on giant outdoor screens. Moments after the whistle, fireworks erupted over the Atlantic Ocean, painting the night sky in brilliant shades of gold and green. Car horns echoed endlessly through the streets as people climbed onto rooftops, danced atop buses, and filled every avenue with music. Samba rhythms returned almost instantly, as though the country itself possessed a heartbeat synchronized with victory. In Salvador, entire neighborhoods spilled into the streets carrying drums that had remained silent throughout the tense closing minutes. In Brasilia, government buildings glowed in Brazil's national colors, while thousands gathered outside, waving flags larger than cars. In Manaus, celebrations erupted along the Amazon River, where boats sounded their horns in unison, creating a chorus unlike anything ever heard before. Every city celebrated differently, yet every celebration meant exactly the same thing. Brazil had found itself again. Inside dressing rooms across Europe, football stars who had once dreamed of wearing the famous yellow jersey watched quietly on television. Some smiled with admiration, others simply nodded, recognizing that they had just witnessed another chapter added to football's greatest mythology. Former champions sent congratulatory messages almost immediately. Retired legends embraced one another inside television studios, unable to hide their emotions despite years spent analyzing matches with professional neutrality. Because they understood something that statistics could never explain. Brazil winning the World Cup always feels different. It is not merely another country lifting another trophy, it is football reconnecting with one of its deepest traditions. Whether supporters love Brazil or spend 90 minutes hoping they lose, almost everyone agrees on one thing. The game somehow feels more complete when the Seleção stand at the very top. Across social media, the internet erupted with astonishing speed. Within minutes, videos of the final whistle accumulated tens of millions of views. Clips of crying supporters spread across every continent. Celebrities, athletes, and musicians posted messages in dozens of languages, while hashtags celebrating Brazil dominated global trends. Some videos captured children watching their very first World Cup triumph. Others showed elderly grandparents embracing grandchildren through tears, finally sharing a moment they had feared they would never experience together. The images spread faster than any headline ever could. A young boy in Recife running barefoot through the streets carrying nothing but a homemade flag. An old man in Porto Alegre carefully unfolding the same Brazilian jersey he had worn decades earlier. A firefighter in Rio stopping his truck simply to hug strangers. Doctors pausing surgeries just long enough to celebrate with exhausted colleagues. Pilots announcing the result over airplane intercoms as passengers applauded somewhere 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. Millions of individual stories instantly became one national memory. Even rival supporters found themselves applauding. Argentine television analysts admitted that Brazil had played with extraordinary courage throughout the tournament. European newspapers described the victory as the rebirth of football's most iconic nation. African and Asian broadcasters praised the team's attacking philosophy, calling it proof that beauty and efficiency could still exist together in modern football. Around the world, neutral fans who had simply hoped for an unforgettable tournament realized they had received something even greater. They had witnessed the return of an empire. For the players themselves, however, reality still felt strangely distant. The medal around each neck seemed almost unreal beneath the bright stadium lights. Some wandered across the pitch long after the celebrations had begun, touching the grass as though trying to convince themselves this place actually existed. Others searched desperately through the crowd for parents, siblings, or childhood coaches who had sacrificed everything to help them reach this stage. One player finally spotted his mother several rows above the tunnel. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Years of sacrifice, rejection, injuries, criticism, and impossible expectations disappeared in a single embrace that lasted only seconds, yet somehow contained an entire lifetime. Meanwhile, the trophy waited patiently on its pedestal, reflecting thousands of flashes from cameras surrounding it. Every generation dreams of lifting it. Countless extraordinary players spend entire careers chasing it without success. Yet tonight, it belonged to Brazil once more. As the captain slowly approached the golden prize, every supporter inside the stadium instinctively rose to their feet again. The noise began quietly before building into something almost impossible to describe. Wave after wave of voices joining together until the sound became less like cheering and more like history announcing its own arrival. When his hands finally wrapped around the trophy and lifted it high above his head, golden confetti exploded into the air, fireworks illuminated the night sky, and a new chapter in football's greatest story officially began. The celebrations did not end when the stadium lights faded. In many ways, they had only just begun. As dawn slowly crept across Brazil, millions of people realized they had never gone to sleep. Entire cities remained awake through the night, their streets still overflowing with music, dancing, and endless waves of green and yellow. Helicopter footage captured avenues so crowded that traffic had become meaningless, while beaches that usually greeted the sunrise with quiet morning walks were transformed into oceans of flags stretching as far as the eye could see. It no longer mattered whether someone came from Rio, Sao Paulo, Salvador, or a tiny village lost in the countryside. For one unforgettable morning, every Brazilian belonged to the same neighborhood. News organizations across the planet immediately interrupted their regular programming. Newspapers that had already prepared dozens of possible front pages discarded every backup plan and rushed new headlines to the printing presses. Television anchors who had spent years covering politics, wars, and global crises suddenly found themselves speaking about football with genuine emotion, because everyone understood that this victory represented far more than 90 minutes on a football pitch. It symbolized the return of a nation that had spent years searching for the confidence that once defined it. In London, giant screens replayed Brazil's winning goal, while commentators described it as the moment world football rediscovered its soul. In Madrid, sports journalists compared the achievement to the legendary Brazilian teams that generations had grown up admiring, arguing that the Seleção had finally escaped the shadow of its own history. Across Italy, newspaper columns praised not only the quality of the football, but the courage with which Brazil had embraced attacking play at a time when so many teams had become obsessed with caution. Even in countries whose supporters had desperately hoped Brazil would fall, there was a reluctant sense of admiration that could not be hidden. The reaction from former players proved even more emotional. Retired legends who rarely displayed their feelings on television struggled to finish complete sentences. Some smiled through tears as they watched the celebrations unfold, while others quietly admitted that this triumph had healed wounds left open for more than a decade. For years, every conversation about Brazilian football had eventually circled back to disappointment, missed opportunities, and impossible expectations. Now, for the first time in a generation, those conversations changed completely. Young players who had once carried the burden of comparison suddenly became the standard against which future stars would be measured. The striker who scored the winning goal instantly became one of the most recognizable athletes on earth. His celebration, arms spread wide beneath a shower of golden confetti, appeared on magazine covers from Tokyo to Buenos Aires within hours. Children copied his every movement in school playgrounds, amateur footballers recreated his finish in local parks, and sports brands competed fiercely to sign endorsement deals before the excitement reached its peak. Yet perhaps the most remarkable transformation occurred far away from the cameras. Across Brazil, thousands of ordinary families experienced something impossible to quantify. Parents who had grown up hearing endless criticism about the national team now watched their own children fall in love with football in exactly the same way previous generations had. Backyards became miniature stadiums. Empty streets turned into improvised football pitches. Old balls were patched together with tape because every child suddenly wanted to become the next hero wearing the famous yellow shirt. Football academies reported record numbers of registrations within weeks. Coaches who had spent years worrying about declining participation suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by eager young players arriving every morning before training even began. Many carried homemade notebooks filled with sketches of their favourite moments from the tournament, while others wore oversized Brazil jerseys that reached almost to their knees. They all shared the same dream, because for the first time, it no longer felt like a fantasy. Someone just like them had climbed to the top of the footballing world. The economic impact spread almost as quickly as the emotional one. Tourism surged as supporters from every continent wanted to experience the country that had once again become football's spiritual home. Murals celebrating the champions appeared on buildings across Rio de Janeiro, Recife, and Belo Horizonte, attracting visitors who treated them almost like historical monuments. Local businesses embraced the celebrations, restaurants introduced menus inspired by famous matches, musicians released songs that instantly became national anthems, and filmmakers rushed to secure exclusive rights for documentaries chronicling the incredible journey to the title. Beyond Brazil's borders, football itself began to change. Coaches around the world spent countless hours analysing the tournament, trying to understand what had made this Brazilian side different. Many expected complicated tactical innovations or revolutionary formations, but the answer seemed almost disappointingly simple. Brazil had reminded everyone that courage could still overcome caution. Instead of playing not to lose, they had chosen to play to inspire, and that philosophy resonated far beyond the tournament itself. Youth academies across Europe began encouraging greater creativity instead of rigid systems. Scouts looked once again for players capable of improvisation rather than simply following instructions. Coaches started speaking publicly about imagination, freedom, and joy, words that had almost disappeared from elite football conversations in recent years. Slowly, but unmistakably, the game itself became more expressive, and many observers traced that shift back to the summer Brazil lifted the World Cup. For rival nations, however, the triumph became a challenge rather than a celebration. Argentina immediately began planning for redemption, determined not to allow their greatest rivals to dominate another era. France launched one of the most ambitious youth development programs in its history, convinced that another generation of champions had to emerge. England invested even more heavily in technical coaching, believing that the gap separating them from football's elite had once again become psychological rather than physical. Every major football nation suddenly possessed a new target, and that target wore yellow. Inside the Brazilian dressing room, life changed just as dramatically. The players who had once enjoyed relative anonymity discovered that every public appearance now attracted thousands of supporters. Airports became impossible to navigate. Restaurants erupted into applause the moment a champion entered the room. Murals bearing their faces appeared in neighbourhoods they had never even visited. They had not simply won football matches. They had become living symbols of hope, perseverance, and national identity. Among them was the youngest member of the squad, a player who had barely featured during the tournament, but had witnessed every emotional moment from the sidelines. During one interview, he admitted that lifting the trophy felt less like reaching the end of a journey and more like accepting responsibility for everything that would follow. His words spread rapidly across social media because they captured something many people had already begun to feel. Winning the World Cup had not ended Brazil's story. It had begun an entirely new chapter. Schools introduced lessons discussing the tournament as an example of resilience and teamwork. Universities analysed the social impact of the victory. Artists painted enormous murals depicting the defining moments of the campaign, while musicians composed songs that blended samba rhythms with recordings of the final whistle and the deafening roar that followed. What had started as a sporting achievement slowly evolved into something much larger, weaving itself into Brazilian culture with extraordinary speed. Months later, whenever people spoke about where they had been during those unforgettable final seconds, every story sounded slightly different, yet every emotion remained exactly the same. Some remembered watching from crowded city squares, others from tiny living rooms packed with relatives, while a few recalled listening through old radios in remote communities where television signals barely reached. The details varied, but the feeling never did. Everyone described the same overwhelming sensation that time had briefly stopped before exploding back to life. Without anyone realizing it, those memories were already becoming history. Children too young to remember the match would one day hear these stories from parents and grandparents, imagining the confetti, the tears, the fireworks, and the impossible noise that echoed across an entire nation. They would grow up believing that this was simply what Brazil did. They would believe that greatness was part of their inheritance. And perhaps that was the greatest consequence of all, because long after the medals had been placed inside glass cabinets and the celebrations had finally faded into memory, Brazil had recovered something even more valuable than the World Cup itself. It had recovered its belief that the impossible could happen again.